I'll start recording now because no, there was no sense re-recording some of the stuff, because otherwise it becomes too much of a same
Okay.
this, and it gets a little tedious after a while. So, okay, so this was, this thing was the change in so the Industrial Revolution had a dramatic, impact. Now, I think I'm going to try to share a different screen if I can. Okay. I don't know if can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
It says you've started screen sharing, but that's all so far.
That's all.
Okay. Oh, how about now?
No, there's
Okay.
nothing except the words.
We're having flashbacks, I think.
Okay.
Don't even say it.
Okay. Anything now?
This is the picture here. Wait a minute.
Yeah, still just the words, Bharat.
That's the only thing it is.
Bharat, hey, could you try sending your slides to Joan, who's your co-host? And have her.
I'm not trying to show the slide. I'm trying to show a regular screen.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm sorry. Yeah,
Your screen sharing, did you put your slides on yet or what?
No, I don't want to show the slide. No, I wanted to show some basic Google Chrome.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah, I'm sorry. I might have clarified. No, I don't want to show you slides right now. I'll get to the slides later on, type thing. So this is,
Okay.
I wanted to show you if I can. Okay, let's see now if I have. Okay. Do you see a slide now?
No.
Not a slide, just the screen
We
sharing.
never saw such wretchedness, such squalor, such rude housing, such meanness in beggary, such utter want of truth and friendship.
We hear a speech.
Terrible
You have the
sight
Chrome open on your computer?
in the darkest dens, nor
Is Chrome open on yours?
Okay, yeah, yeah, it was, this, okay, I think all right, let's go back to the slides, probably that's easier type of thing, so we'll just stick with, okay, this, I was trying to portion of a screen, share.
Hurrah!
Okay, all right.
Perfect.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. So, okay, so what I was trying to show is to, like some of you may know that, there is a website called Gresham College, which has several lectures, and this has a talk about the Victorians and their travel and their attitude towards race. And this is a lecture which I will send out to those of you who have time, by Professor Evans. And he talks about when after the industry, obviously, we know that Britain was the first to industrialize, okay, and then they started traveling to continental Europe, and their impression of continental Europe was something they were stuck in the medieval ages. So they're actually an Englishman named, I think, Matthew or something. He wrote a book about travel through Europe, and he describes the squalor and the poverty and this, and the filth that is there. And one would think that he's describing India. No, he's describing Germany. And when I read it, it was just amazing how he just like, oh, I mean, their habits are this thing, they're fat, they're they're covered with dirt, So it was an amazing description of quote unquote Middle Europe, by the eminent Victorians, who finally had money, they had better hygiene, and they were able to travel in style through Europe. And their impression, of Europe was just, it's a mind-boggling. This was like a food type thing. And obviously, this is, again, as we talked about, this is soon after Darwin. So the idea of, we are the top of the racial heap was unreal type thing. So it's like, it just reminds you of like, what like Monty Python would say, okay, let's, the Italians are, this, the French are this, the Germans are barbaric, and what about the Belgians? Oh, let's just ignore them. That was one of the sketch on Belgium. So it was amazing how, like looking it up, the French were frogs, the Italians were swarthy, and, and the Germans were, loud and crude. And, so it was an interesting how some of these attitudes that had traveled through the early days of science, rightly or wrongly type of thing, And obviously, we talked about in the genetics class about Galton and Malthus doctrine and the libertarian policies that were, would be a big, woke type of thing. So the local politics, as well as the advances in science, rightly or wrongly, and again, obviously, that so-called phrenology science was in vogue, so they were measuring, the skulls of the Brahmins versus, and I think, some of you were in my genetics or the human evolution class, they had collected some, Brahmin skulls and the American native skulls. And so that was, the rise of the phrenology, of the so-called pseudoscience that was in vogue. So they were classifying people, and again, as I mentioned last week, the rise of statistics had a huge impact with this. So the science was, along with reinforcing some of the preconceived notions that the middle class and the upper class had. Okay, and at the same time, I alluded to in the last part of the second recorded lecture. I'm sorry, go ahead, somebody had a comment. Oh, yes, yeah, the poor, yeah, exactly. So that was, that no question, it was a very class society type of thing.
You're frozen. Right, you're frozen. I'll call him. Hi, Bharat's frozen again on the lectures. Thank you.
He's disappeared now.
Yeah, she's getting him on the phone. Hi, you were frozen, but now you've disappeared. And you're not screen sharing anymore. So you want me to just stay on the phone until you get it together and so I can tell you? Okay. I think I'm going to get a mirror so I can just hold it up. So I think that'll be a good addition.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Let's try screen share and let's see what it looks like.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, got it?
Perfect.
Okay, yeah. It's interesting how it just kicks me out. I think, it's there. Okay, I think, yeah, we are. So this is where we were, so to speak, like, and let me make sure the phone, I think it may be. All right, so, so we talked about, how the Victorian attitudes were strongly influenced by the advances in science, the so-called good science and pseudoscience, which include the measurement of skulls, which is phrenology, and at the same time, the science which was valid, which is the Malthusian doctrine and the early input of statistics and collecting data. So this had a huge influence on how they interpreted, the other people different than themselves, not just in the subcontinent, but also in Middle Europe. So that's what we were discussing earlier. And again, the Enlightenment slowly but steadily caught up with the Muslim minority in the subcontinent as well. That some of the reform and the traditions of Western education, science, astronomy, and looking outside their little, area, got, established in the Muslim community as well, with the establishment of learning, English and different cultures, and the advances, were done by some of the reformers. Okay, and they again highly outlined the differences that were occurring between the two major religions, Hinduism and again, at the same time, the mutiny of 1857 was a big shock to the rulers who were in the subcontinent, and they realized that, and that is when the army composition was changed from the predominantly from almost 80%, 75% Indian. They reduced the number of, they increased the number of Europeans, including mercenaries from other parts of the Europe, and sending more Scottish and Irish nationals to serve in the subcontinent. So the proportion of the army. Yeah, hello? Hello? Oh, no, sorry, it was the wrong number. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't frozen again. So the things were changed in the proportion. And not only that, some of the major cities which were part of the mutiny were rebuilt. For example, there's a city in the foothills of Himalayas called Kanpur. It was Kanpur now, but it was pronounced in the British era as Cawnpore. Okay, and that was totally rebuilt, so to speak. The narrow streets were wiped out. Some of the houses were demolished, and a wide, grid-like structure was laid out. And not because of traffic and steamships, or for road, but so that the cannons can fire straight down in case there was a mutiny. So that is how something, and even parts of the Delhi where, there's two divided, New Delhi and Old Delhi. And especially the European community started ruling on the periphery, and something, not colonies, was called military cantonment and clubs. So it was, so there was made to a secluded, highly guarded area. So the segregation that was coming around. And the other route of segregation was, okay, that took place after 1850s, was with the advent of the steamships. The women started traveling. So they put their foot down, said, no more this having mistresses and having mixed race children. So they put their foot down. So the segregation became much more entrenched, and the society again became a lot more regimented. The people, the military people and the administrative people were at the top of the hierarchy, so to speak, of the European establishment, followed by the, people, the lower level this thing, and the traders and other people were the lowest of the thing. They were European, type thing, but they were not part of the military and the administrative cadre. So at the club, there was a strong pecking order type of thing that was established, and it was a very formal, strictly regimented European society that took place. And most of the people had no real contact with the local population. They dealt with either their servants, or with memos and paperwork. So that was, that was a social structure that was there. So it was in the structure was there with the entertainment, and the lot of the ordinary soldiers was rather poor because they lived on their salaries were limited. They lived in barracks, and then again, I think our friend Nick had brought up the question about the social structure type of thing, that the amount that was spent on military was huge of the military upkeep, that only 1% of the total revenue was spent on education. Okay, the British Army and the establishment paid more on the military barracks than on education, and some of the princely states spent a lot more progressive ones spent more money on education than the government herself. So that was one of the big, criticism that one can live as to the amount of education that was spent. So that, and as opposed to Japan or even Brazil, type of thing, that after the independence, they spent a lot more money. And even the people who got educated were the upper class Brahmins, the traders, and the rich Muslims. And again, the women education was left solely lacking, type of thing. And that problem still continues in the subcontinent, so to speak. That there is a lot more primary education, but the opportunities that should be available, to the people who are left behind are still lagging substantially. Okay, and again, we already talked about the Wahhabism. Okay, and when we talked about the princes, that they can. Now there are several scholarly work that were done, type of thing, and I will send out a summary of a big book that I had read about, written by a American-based scholar. That was probably about 30 years old, 20 or 30 years old, but it's still very good analysis on how the princely India, which is the 2/5 of it, okay, talk about the lifestyle. Most of them, obviously, almost all of them were males. They were, the early marriage, and even the Hindu princes and kings were following the Muslim traditions of so-called parda, or the women behind veils, so to speak. So that became entrenched even amongst all the local princes. So the women were, and again, a polygamy was in practice, that even a lot of the Hindu princes, had multiple wives, and some of the Muslim princes, had not just had many wives, but had many concubines as well. So it was a very, very feudalistic societies, to put it very in plain English. Okay, again, how they legitimized themselves because of being of male heirs, and again, they trace themselves that they were descendant of the, just like the French, the Sun King, so to speak. Some of the Rajput kings, justified that their kingdom continued, to the sun god, so to speak. Some of the local Hindu princes trace their things that they were the worshippers of Shiva or Krishna, so they trace their, quote unquote, their lineage going back to the local, one of the Hindu gods, so to speak. And at the same time, they established, they were not just sitting around, eating, sweets, but they also had substantial role in giving patronage to the local temples and also the mosques, and local schools, arts. And they started some of the hospitals, and some of them underhandedly also financed the freedom struggle, while trying to avoid the watchful eyes of the British resident, who was, probably, had a lot more control in the smaller kingdoms, and the princes and the Nawabs established, where power was dependent upon the approval of the British resident. And at the same time, what was the impression of the other side about the princes? Okay, some of the British viceroys considered them as natural born leaders. The others looked down upon them as naughty schoolboys, basically. Okay, and and a lot of them, they tried to train them in European fashion by giving, like teachers and European nannies. Okay, and so they were kind of groomed to rule in the European fashion, and then later on, well, special colleges were established. Some of them went to UK to be educated, in the proper English way, so to speak. But at the same time, interracial marriage was frowned upon, type of thing. So, and so these were some of the cultural things that were carrying on. They were allowed to adopt. Finally, after the mutiny, they realized that adoption was, something that they could not control. They were allowed to adopt, male heir of their own choice. So the varieties of, ways they tried to keep them, under control, at the same time giving them just enough independence so that they would continue to be allies, and sort of, like rule, in an indirect rule fashion. Okay, and again, just to give you an idea of this, is you've seen this map before, but it is worth repeating, as the areas in the blue are clear-cut, the so-called princely state, and it's a substantial part. And as much as 2/5 of population was still living under the princely estates, and they had absolutely no contact with, with the English rulers, and the resident was obviously the kings, and the royalty had contact with the British resident, British surgeons, but the local populations, and some of them, again, not just as naughty schoolboys, they were classified as effeminate scoundrels, so to speak, and some of them were really extremely small in area. Out of about 560 princely states, 450 had area of less than 1,000 square miles. Some of them were ridiculously small, like 1 square miles. Okay, and so this was, really a strange mixture of that had arisen, and some of them were relics of the Muslim, rule, and Maratha rule, and again, so this was a freedom system that was continued, and at the same time, the big states, which we will focus more, as we go along, was the Kashmir, Hyderabad, this is a state called Baroda state, where I went to university, Mysore state in the south, and Travancore, which had a very strong economy, based on coastal trade. So these were the important ones that will played a big role in 1947, when the Brits decided to finally withdraw. Okay, and again, this was a college to train the princes was established in northern India as early as 1868. This was primarily designed for princes and was based on the British public school model of emphasizing sports and manly pursuits. Okay, and so this was, again, and finally, I can just see this looks straight out of Harry Potter, so to speak. Reminds you of, and the buildings were, really, and obviously this were financed by the princes, and so much so that when one of the colleges opened up, one of the Maharajas came with an entourage of servants and on an elephant to go to school. So this was, obviously whether to laugh or to cry, or mock, as to how. Okay, so this was, one of the, big Rajkumar college that was established, and some of them, did rise. And the second was, a Mayo college that was established as well, in India. This was again a boarding school, like Eton of India, and it was not just populated by the Indian princes, but some of the sultans of the Middle East, after the Brits exercised control, were also went. And some of these buildings were designed by Lockwood, the father of Rudyard Kipling. And this has nothing to do with the Mayo Clinic, by the way. This has to do with Viceroy Mayo. Okay, and so this was, and you can see how the magnificent style of the buildings that were there. So, and again, obviously the horses, sports, and polo were the big this thing. And there was, and these colleges are still very much in existence, as you can see from the stamp that was issued by the government of India of the same Mayo College. Okay. And again, so this was, and this is one of the maps of the India that is bordering Pakistan. You can see how many states that are there. It's like, it's almost, like crazy. The biggest state is the one in red, but there are a lot of small princely kingdoms type of thing. So, okay. And you can just see it was a monumental task as to how to get all these little fiefdoms under control at the time of independence. Okay. Because in 1947, when Prime Minister Attlee decided to give around independence, again, they had announced that the so-called paramountcy of the crown was coming to an end and would not be transferred directly to either of the two dominions, i.e. India or Pakistan. So it was really a royal mess, to put it mildly, that was left for the Indian politicians to solve as to how these people will decide to join either one or two. And obviously, some of them were looking out of their own interest, especially the Nizam of Hyderabad and the big, boiling pot that is still left called Kashmir. They decided that, well, they didn't want part of either of these dominions. They will do their own thing, so to speak. And so that was a big mess. And it took some heroic Machiavellian effort on the part of three people. The first is the last viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten. The second was the lawyer, and Gandhi is number two person, or the Gandhi follower named Mr. Patel, and the third one was an administrator named Mr. V.P. Menon. So these three people managed to get all these 560 people to either decide. And some of them were really, really well-meaning. They decided that what is good for the common good. So you can see that, as I may have mentioned on the last tape, that some of these people, this was the biggest land reform that took place, without bloodshed. Because you can imagine some of these states had their own private army, so to speak. They could jolly well defend themselves, So there would have been a real, bloodbath that could have taken place, and it almost actually did in Kashmir, and in Hyderabad, as we'll talk at length, type of thing. So that is the focus of the class. So this was, and now, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, that these princely states were sort of stayed outside the main foray of the Indian struggle for independence that started as early as 1885 and continued, from a gentlemanly club, which was primarily the Indian National Congress in the early days, until it became a mass movement under Gandhi, who faced racial discrimination in South Africa and took the struggle to the masses and villages. Okay, so this was, and so he part of democratized or expanded the freedom struggle. But again, it was consigned mostly to the British India rather than princely India. Okay, because they were, they were under the strong thumb of the British resident. And obviously they wanted to stay loyal to the crown because that is what they owned their independence to, type of thing. So that was the big, okay. And this is interesting that, as I mentioned, that you can see that the Bengalis were the earliest ones. And this is the Presidency College that was established, one of the earliest colleges which Western education was established. And this person who actually made India more English educated was minor administrator named Thomas Bennington Macaulay. Okay, and he was posted in Calcutta back in the early 19th century. And what he did was very interesting, that he changed the language of administration from Persian to English. And that forced all the locals to study English if they wanted to deal with the government, okay, and made Persian, okay, sort of, a language that was, no longer in vogue. And at the same time, the language of the masses, which is Hindi, which was written in, and they changed the script from writing in the Persian fashion, from the backward way, the way Arabic is written, to the changing the script to more Sanskrit based. So that gave the a majority of people a better access to writing the script. So that was some of the big changes that took place. And this was again, now, who were the people who were strongly against involvement of, there were two schools of thought that took place. That the established in London wanted to give more role to the locals in administration, and there were a lot more liberal outlook, because remember that this was the Gladstonian era, and the liberalism was in vogue, okay, after Disraeli, okay, so that influenced how they wanted to treat the locals. At the same time, the local traders who were there, who were lower on the social pole, and there were the traders, the indigo farm owners, or the tea farm owners, they wanted to keep their status quo. So they were a lot more racist, so to speak. And this brings us to an episode of 1877, that one of the governor, viceroys, sorry, that's the correct word, named Lord Ebert, had introduced a bill where the educated Indians could be elected judges. But the establishment of the traders and the merchants and the mill owners, strongly protested that there is no way a dark-skinned Bengali should be allowed to sit in justice to a white man. And there was a lot of violence that took place. They were not averse to beating up their servants, and even inflicting corporate punishment, so to speak. So they did not want to be tried by the Bengalis, and the protests went all the way to London, and finally, obviously, the viceroy decided that there is no way he could protest a substantial number of white traders and mill owners. So that bill was squashed, actually.
Bharat,
Yeah.
I'm sorry for the interruption. I can't make it happen, but I'm going to get ready to leave. Can you make Kevin co-host?
Oh, sure, I will try it. Yeah, okay.
So if anything goes wrong, he can take care of it.
Sure.
I couldn't accomplish it as co-host.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think we're doing good type of thing, so I think we should, as long as I don't.
Okay, it's done. Good,
Yeah,
thank you.
As long as I try not to get cute, I'll be fine, Okay, yeah, I think we only have about 20-30 minutes, So this was, Macaulay type of thing, okay? And then this is, okay, excuse me, yeah, let the slide populate. And you can see the slide that's coming in now, that is the start of the Indian National Congress. That was started by some of the more liberal reformers who were, decided that they wanted more say in ruling themselves, so to speak. And they were writing petitions and appeal to the establishment, not just in Calcutta, but also in London, And this may come as a shock to you that one of the Parsi businessmen had actually gone to London and had run for the member of parliament and was elected as a member of parliament as early as 1877. Now, I don't know exactly where Finbury is, but from a Finbury seat, he won a seat in the parliament, by a narrow majority. and obviously a local opposition that there is no way an Indian should represent, native-born Brits. But he did win an election, and he sat in the parliament, I think for the Liberal Party, if I recall. And so this was the early forays as to how the movement started backwards. And this was again, the start was the 1877 was the big famine that took place, And at that time, the rations that were given, because there was the laissez-faire attitude that, the people were obviously the non-survivals, those who were unfit to survive could die. So the rations that were given. So there was some tremendous famine that took place, huge famine that took place, 1877. Okay. Now again, getting back to the princes, the common ground that the administrators and the civil surgeon and the military had was with the princes. The hunting was a big thing as to see that there was a huge amount of, as many as like this was the common ground of shooting tiger and sticking pigs, okay, and the tiger hunts, so that some of the Maharanis and they were all obviously they were military, and you can see one of the women Maharanis shooting, and this was not a Muslim Begum, it was a Hindu Maharani, and she's obviously an accomplished hunter, okay, and this was obviously they were not short of manpower. As many as 1,000 people participated in each tiger hunts. They were so-called beaters who would beat the tiger to the area where either the visiting British gentry or the viceroy could shoot from the height of the howdah by sitting on top of the elephant. Okay, and so this was and this was one of the Maharajas is said to have shot 1,100 tigers. Okay, so and you can imagine how the decimation of the tiger population was that thing. So and this was and so this was a big cultural get together. Sometimes they tethered the goats and other animals to attract tigers, and some of them. So this was an interesting cultural overlap that was taking place. And again, we talked already at length about attitudes. A lot of them were despotic, autocrat, feudal relics. There are a few good rulers, but they were again considered as natural allies. And obviously, they had enough revenue of themselves that they were traveling to Europe and were lavish spenders. Okay, and they were big purchasers of Rolls Royce and British goods, so to speak. And they built their palaces in what came to be known as Indo-Saracen style. So a lot of the palaces were constructed by British architects and engineers in a cultural amalgamation of European, Roman, Gothic, and Muslim style. So this was an interesting, and some will show over. I'll go some over the palaces, as we talked about the individual. And again, the overlapping ground was sports and cricket and polo. And obviously, there were extravagant plans of jewelry and luxury hotels, And at the same time, alcoholism was rampant among some of the princes, because, and this was an interesting tale. One of the princes said, that it is your empire that made me, because my original job was fighting, and you took that away from me. So what else I'm left with is drinking and, debauchery. So that was, a rather perverse argument that was advanced by one of the princes that you guys made me what I am, type of thing, so to speak. And and I can understand, that this was, that they had become sort of impotent, so to speak. And so this was the indirect rule concept that was, very much to their benefit, that the defense and foreign policies that were controlled by the Brits. And at the same time, and they were paying, from the revenue from the princes. And again, so this was, and some of the native states, had higher taxation than directly ruled British areas, okay, type of thing. So it was, and very few of them had good roads or public goods, so in terms of, but at the same time, there's some of the canals and railways that went through their princely kingdom. So it was a strange mixture took place of good and evil, so to speak, on both sides. Okay, all right, okay, and now at the same time, when Queen Victoria had made announcement that they are all our British subjects, and we issued the main proclamation. We may tend to unite in bonds of close affection of ourselves and our subjects, that from the highest to the humblest of all may feel that under our rule the great principles of liberty, equality, and justice are secured for them to promote their happiness, to add their prosperity, to advance their welfare, are the ever-present aims and objects of our empire coronation. And this was read out in multiple languages, including Persian, word by word, to the Indian population. Okay, and again, the words, but at the same time, this poor famine was going on, and to announce this empress, there was a whole darbar, was held to celebrate the coronation. And so this was, by darbar word means, like a big get together of the princes. They were all encouraged to come with their finest, jewels and decorations and medals, okay, and bow to the representative of Her Majesty. Okay, so a lot of the Maharaja and Nawabs, as well as the intellectuals and who is who of the society, were invited. And at the great cost, of this big party was held. At the same time, there was some enterprising divan or minister named Mr. Joshi, who came in homespun cloth and read out a very humble appeal for Her Majesty to grant India the same political and social status as is enjoyed by her British subjects. So that was, an appeal that was made to the Queen as early as 1877. And as we shall see, it took at least 75 years for his wishes to come true, type thing. So, and again, this has a lot to do with the powers of who controlled the party, because when the Liberals and the Labour were in power, they started to give more role to the locals in administration. When the Tory government was ruling, that was tightened. Okay, and at the same time, geopolitics had a lot effect, and this was, it had how effect on how the subcontinent was ruled. Okay, and let me see if I can zoom in without. Okay, and the proclamation was read in English and Urdu, and again, we had that already, and the varieties of medals were issued, type of thing, and obviously, appeal to the vanity of the local kings, that went a long way. See, the Kaiser, okay, obviously the word traces back to Caesar, Empress of India, Hind ka Kaiser. This is written in Hindi, India's Kaiser. So these were varieties of title and medals that were handed out to various, Victoria, so 1877, okay. So this was, and at the same time, there were two main decisions that were taken. There was this establishment of Privy Council, and this is how various states were recognized, because obviously the gun salute, that was a big thing. Some of the bigger states were given gun salutes of 21 guns, 19 guns, 17 guns. So that was, one way to, keep them happy, and varieties of title. The Knight Commander of India, okay, so varieties, and then all the way down to Rai Bahadur, or which was equivalent to giving Sir title. So varieties of titles were given out, type of thing, and obviously Peter and I knows as to how the title of Sir became very popular, and the Rao, like the KCI, call me God, that even God calls me God, so to speak. GCI, the title, okay. call me God, CIG, kindly call me God, GIC, even God calls me God, so the varieties of title were handed out, not only just in Britain itself, but also in India, the varieties of titles. Hey, now, this is Fabian society. This is not the Fabian we were talking about, okay? This is the wrong Fabian, by the way, with Ed Sullivan. This is actually the Fabian society. That this was a socialistic society that was founded in the UK as early as 1884. And yes, socialism was not considered a dirty word at that time, okay? And many of the future leaders of the so-called third world were exposed to this society, the most notable one being Jawaharlal Nehru, who subsequently formed the economic policy of the subcontinent based on this social guidelines, okay. And even though, and you can see this was British socialism to some extent for social justice, minimum wage, okay, universal health coverage, abolishment of the upper class lords. So and this was some who is who of the British establishment were members of the Fabian Society. By GBS, I mean George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Ramsay MacDonald, who went on to become the Prime Minister, Emily Parkhurst, who was head of the women's vote movement, okay, Bertrand Russell, the great mathematician come philosopher. And so this was a huge thing. And at the same time, the idea of socialism, which was practiced very enthusiastically after independence by Jawaharlal Nehru, did not work out so well because, the top-heavy license Raj that took place, had so-called Hindu growth of rate of growth, so to speak. So from the big, and he had traveled through the Soviet Union, and everybody was looking toward the Soviet Union as the model of success back from 1919 to almost 1940. That includes varieties of spies, including Kim Philby, and varieties of people, the famous five who handed the secrets of the war, just because they believed in the socialistic cause, including Aldous Huxley and other intellectuals in Britain. Okay, and so and finally, this is one of the Indian ambassadors. Finally, he was a British Indian ambassador in the Kennedy era to the United States, and he had given a lecture of the retreat from socialism. So this was a big, political and social thought processes that were in. And then again, the Darbar said, one time it's successful, do it again. So this was the big Darbar that was probably the grandest of all that was held in 1903 by the current Governor General, who was Lord Curzon. Okay, and so this was again one of the most glamorous and highly expensive Darbar that took place in Delhi. And around that time, he moved the capital from Calcutta to Delhi. Okay, and again at that time, he established various monuments to the crown in Calcutta, and this is still very much there. One of the largest monuments to the monarch, and 64 acres of garden, which is now a museum. That was in 1912. It was finished, and King George V announced the transfer of capital from Calcutta to New Delhi. And part of it was, and this is a picture at night, it's a huge, and there are statues of the Queen and Viceroy Curzon at that time. And obviously part of the reason was because the Bengalis were considered troublemakers, because by this time they were throwing bombs and trying to assassinate some of the British administrators in Calcutta. So they just thought it was time to get out of this trouble city, so to speak, and leave it to the traders and the merchants, to fend for themselves, so to speak. And also, and also to show the continuity of the Raj to the Mughal establishment in Delhi. So that was again, a very shrewd political move, so to speak, that took place. Okay, so it was continued, to administer from, and again, it was closer to Simla, which was the winter capital, so to speak, for traveling. So the whole Raj moved to the hill stations, which was so-called mini Switzerland. Okay, and again, this is some of you may have seen the movie Victoria and Abdul. So her fascination for India continued, that his main servant, or chaprasi it was called, was a Muslim guy named Abdul. And this was made into a movie starring none other than Dame Judi Dench, made Queen Victoria. So it's an interesting story about the relationship after she became widow. And after her Scottish assistant died, Mr. Brown, and this was a guy named Abdul. And she trusted him immensely, to the chagrin of the ministers of the crown. Okay. And this was, she constructed in her retreat on Isle of Wight, the so-called Darbar. So this is not in one of the Maharajas' place. This is Queen Victoria's retreat, her sort of recreational home, her and Prince Albert home in Isle of Wight. Okay. And so she trusted the Munshi to give her advice and keep her posted as to what was happening in the subcontinent. And he was able to write letters, to Agra. And obviously, he favored the Muslim establishments. Well, Muslims are the victims, so to speak, So he had the ear of Her Majesty. Okay, and she would write, letters or send cables to the Viceroy. Give extra protection should be given to the painful quarreling, so that the Muslims could carry out their ceremonies in peace. And this Darbar was designed by Lockwood Kipling. So it just shows how the ties to the empire traveled to the palace. Okay, and these are some of the pictures of the Darbar, that Curzon did in that thing. Now again, and some of the pictures of the king and queen of the Delhi Darbar, which was the third and the final one. Okay, and the Nizam bowing to paying homage to the queen, king and queen, 1911. So, and by this time, photography was, available, and even some of the earliest color photography was that. Okay, let me see if this one plays.
We see images, but there's no sound.
Okay, all right, yeah, I see, okay. Can you hear now?
No.
Oh, okay, you couldn't hear it, I see, okay, so video is not optimized, okay. Okay, let me go back and see if it. Let me know if you can hear it. Okay, I think we'll have to skip that, yeah, because I think otherwise it'll glitch. Okay, so can you see the slide now? Okay, yeah, all right. So this is, the Red Fort of the Mughal king, and this was the Viceroy Palace that was built at a huge cost. This is one of the largest private residence that was in Delhi, and it is now used for the government purposes for India's president, various administrative offices. So it's like they're almost like 2,000 servants manning this big building. That's the Viceroy Palace of Delhi, which stayed the seat of the power from 1910 until 1947, and it's still being used, in the so-called New Delhi area type. And we talked about that during the Curzon era, they had adventured into Tibet because they were worried about the Tsarist Russia, and the Tibet was still like really a 16th century kingdom, and they were fighting with horses and arrows against machine guns, and obviously they were lost and decided to sign for peace, and that was the borderline that was drawn between Tibet and the British Empire. And again, one of the biggest advantage the Brits had, that they had the theodolite. So they did the extreme detailed survey of the subcontinent. So their maps were absolutely, for the first time, they were most precise map, and that paid for the land revenue as well as for drawing borders, and obviously, they had a lot more say type of thing. So this border was decided in 1914 in Simla between the Tibetans, Lama's representative, and the British government. And again, the Chinese, obviously, after they took over Tibet, said we didn't have anything to do with it. And that is still the huge bone of contention between the 1962 war that took place between India and China. Okay, because so that was that we talked about so this was one of the arbitrary lines that was drawn. And now again, 1910 was a very critical year for that time, because that is when Lord Curzon, who was Tory and always thought that he should be the prime minister, was the viceroy, and Bengal was one of the largest provinces that had huge Muslim and had Hindu population. So he decided to divide Bengal into two, east and west. And a lot of people just thought that this was kind of trying to separate two areas based on religion. Because if you remember the present day history, the East Bengal ended up in Bangladesh now, while the west is Calcutta and Hindu. So a lot of the raw material that came from the east, the manufacturing was done in the West Bengal, around Calcutta. So this was considered as a political move by the large number of population, the Muslims and Hindu. So there were huge protests, and finally Curzon had to actually cancel the partition of Bengal. So that was the start of the political awakening that took place, especially in the whole large Bengal province, and along with and then again, obviously, the India played a huge role in the First World War. As you can see, the numbers. Australia sent 5 million. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think. And this is 100,000 type of thing, so or 50,000, so to speak. Well, India had sent 315,000. So it's a huge number of Indian soldiers who played role in the British for British. They fought not only just in France, but also a huge number against the Ottoman Empire, which was part of the which was aligning with Germany. And you can see this, the French lady, trying to give a flower to this Sikh soldier. And so this was, and again, this opened up the eyes of the uneducated or poorly educated Indian soldiers who fought in Europe. And they saw the poverty, they saw the bad leadership that was offered in the First World War. And again, that opened up their eyes, and they came home with the idea, just a similar way the dissolution of the Vietnam, that they came back with asking for more rights and say in testing. So, and again, they were promised so-called dominion. They were hoping to get a dominion status like Calcutta, like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and only that they were, and this led to the. I'll say, just give me one more minute and I'll stop at this type of thing. So, okay, and again, this time the Soviet Union was in turmoil, so to speak, in 1917, and the Brits decided that they did not want any sedition in Punjab, which was a lot more close to the Soviet border. And when the protesters gathered in a small park in present-day Punjab. Okay, the British administrator decided to send in machine guns and shot about 900 people just without any warning, so to speak, and that was sent shockwaves not just through the subcontinent, but also in the British Parliament as to how we could rule this way. And that created a huge fracture between the Indian independence movement and the Brits, starting from 1919. And whatever hopes that they had of getting a Dominion status were, put to rest. And that struggle continued from 1920 onwards to 1947. So we'll stop at this stage and we'll continue with the history stories and the partition that took place and the role next week. Okay.
Thanks, Bharat. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fabulous. As always, learned tons.
And I think at least this time it didn't kick me out too much. I'm sharing. I think I have to share only part of the screen that reduced the bandwidth, and that works nicely. Type of thing. I think what we did was, I think so. And because I had 3 backups, I had a laptop in next to the router, and I even have a tablet. So this time, so I'll see two of you tomorrow, type of thing.
Yes, and also the rest next week. Be great. Looking forward to it.
Okay, now I'll send out the recording because I think the other 2 parts were already there. So, okay, bye-bye.